Okay, welcome. This is the second part of the Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant talk. And this is, of course, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Thank you for sticking around and being here for the next talk as we work our way through the entire Bible. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's going to be worth it. It's going to be a big adventure. Now, we left off talking about Genesis 15 and Melchizedek right before that, but we wanted to touch on the rescue of Lot. And this shows us the courage and the bravery of Abraham, and he takes on the 5 pagan kings. And so Lot and his family, who, again, relative of Abraham, and the wives, they all get taken captive by these pagans. And one of these groups is the Amalekites, and the Amalekites, Amalek, they're going to be continual problems for the Israelites in this period. And we read in verse 8, it says, "Now the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela went out together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. So there's a big battle going on, 4 kings against 5 kings. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell in there. But those who left fled to the mountains. Then they took the cavalry of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Then one who escaped and came and told Abram the Hebrew, who at that time dwelt by the oak of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abraham. Now when Abram heard that his brother Lot was taken captive, he armed 318 trained servants born in his own house, and they went and pursued them as far as Dan. So he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked and pursued them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. And so he brought back all the cavalry of Sodom, and also brought back his brother Lot and all of his goods, as well as the women and the people. And so we have here, after this, if you recall in part 1, we have the blessing of Melchizedek, right? And the typology of Melchizedek. And it's interesting in the notes that they do liken this trained servants of Abraham. Abraham is basically, for all intents and purposes, a kind of king, right? He's a tribal leader, a sort of a king, you could say. And in many ways, Abraham is also prophetic. He's a prophet. And there's an aspect of priesthood to Abraham as well, because he offers the sacrifices when God makes covenant with him. And he, being the descendant of Adam and being the descendant of Noah, he's also going to be key in the lineage to the descendants of the Messiah, as we said. And this is why we have to hold to the validity of the genealogies of the Bible and the historicity of these people. Because Christ came into history. Christ is not a Platonic thought form. He's not something abstract like a Greek deity or a form. He's an actual God who came into time and space and took on human nature. And so Genesis 14:14, the church fathers likened to the Council of Nicaea the 318 bishops who were present at the Council of Nicaea, which is an interesting, just providential fact, who were the opponents of the insurmountable odds when the entire Roman Empire almost was Arian. Most of the church had fallen prey to Arianism and semi-Arianism, which taught that the second person of the Godhead, Jesus, was a creature. He was a noble creature, the first of God's creatures, but still a creature, and not fully divine, and that, of course, was refuted at Nicaea. As we mentioned, the order of Melchizedek and all that in the first part, but what we see here in this, the blessings to Abraham, if you remember, again, God would be with him and would defeat the enemies that fought against Abraham because Abraham was faithful and obeyed the covenant promises, right? If you obey, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. Abraham believes this, but he doesn't just notionally believe it, he acts on it. So it's a living, active faith from 12 to 13 to 14 to 15. And so we could say that there's a threefold blessing to Abraham. One of my old notes here is that you have a promise of nationhood in 15, and the fulfillment is the Mosaic covenant. In Genesis 17, you have a promise of a dynasty, and that's fulfilled in the Davidic covenant. And then in Genesis 22, you have the worldwide blessing that's promised, that's fulfilled in the new covenant in Christ. So there's actually future covenants are also included within the within the Abrahamic covenant. So again, remember, 15 is the nationhood, the promise of nationhood that's fulfilled with Moses. 17 is the kingly, which is fulfilled in the Davidic covenant. And then the worldwide blessing, Genesis 22, is fulfilled in the new covenant. Now, the worldwide blessing isn't just mentioned in Genesis 22. It's also mentioned earlier on in 12 and 15 too. But the next point that we want to look at is that Abraham showed detachment, as the notes say here, because he also was very wealthy, but he knew that God had given him this wealth. It wasn't something that he thought he had obtained on his own. And so he had a proper understanding of being detached. He wasn't an idolater with his earthly things. And the kings of Sodom, the pagan kings were. They wanted to establish an earthly kingdom. And that's why Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith chapter, as it's known, looks back to Abraham as a guy who was a saint, because even at this time, he was looking for the heavenly city of God and not an earthly city. And this is key because we always want to stress and show that even the Old Testament saints understood and knew that in the New Testament period, that's where the Messiah would come and would direct everybody to the eternal realities and not just to building a kingdom or a house or a city here and now. And that's why the Abrahamic covenant ultimately is in Christ and in the eschaton, the eternal state. And it's not primarily concerned with a land deal in Palestine. Now, the conquering of the promised land is a type, it's a part of that fulfillment, but that's the historical fulfillment that looks ahead to the eschaton, you see. That's why we don't fall into the premillennial Zionist view or the evangelical view or these heresies that don't understand the real fulfillment, and they get stuck on the kind of historical fulfillment of this in relationship to the land of Palestine. It's not beer, by the way. It's I don't drink. This is cold brew coffee. So people think I'm sneaking beers or something. No, my gut can't handle beer. I can't stand beer. I haven't had a drink in years, 3, 4, 5 years. I don't even remember. But not that I think it's wrong to drink. Anyway, every time I drink something out of a bottle, though, people say, "I seen him on a live stream in a video. He was drinking alcohol. He's a liar. He's a liar." All right, Genesis 15, very important chapter. One of the most important. The city. Oh, by the way, so we wanted to stress again the city of man. If you have the Orthodox Study Bible, the notes in 14:21-24, that theme of the city of God versus the city of man is brought to the forefront there in that note. We read in 15:1-3 of what's called a theophany. Now, we've seen a few theophanies already of the appearance of God within time and space to the saints. How is it possible for the unknowable essence of God, the beyond being, to appear in time and space? It sounds ludicrous. It sounds impossible. And in fact, many world religions would affirm that it is not possible. Islam, for example, as we've been researching recently, extensively getting deeper and deeper into the history of Islamic thought and philosophy and theology to prepare for the upcoming Islamic debates. The continuing problem in Islamic theology is the question of how God can actually speak to us in this world in time and space in the Quran, if God cannot enter into and speak his word into time and space because he's not in any way like creation. So we have what's called a dialectic, where we'll have some world religions will set up the beyond being aspect of the absolute, what's called in the Greek aparon, as in a dialectic against the here and the now, the time and the space, created reality that we inhabit. Now, we as Orthodox have the solution to this in the essence-energy distinction. God is not knowable or present in terms of his inner essence, his nature, but he is present to us within time and space, within history, according to his personal energies. The energies are inhypostatized. That means that they exist in the mode of person. And that's how we can see and know and understand that the Logos, the second person of the Godhead, Jesus, is actually here present speaking to Abraham. It's Jesus who comes into time and space in a theophany. Theophany is very important, very fundamental, very central to Orthodox theology, and that's why we have the Feast of Theophany that, of course, refers to the baptism of Christ, right? Theophanies are very important to us, and they occur all throughout the Old Testament at very key junctures. And every theophany is a pre-incarnate manifestation of God, and particularly of the person of Christ, anticipating the incarnation of Christ. So, in other words, if theophanies are possible, and they are in Scripture, then incarnation is possible. So it's a very small step. It's a logical flow from looking at the theophanies, knowing and understanding that the theophanies occur, that is God himself within time and space, via his ever-present power, glory, and energy in these theophanies. And yet at the same time, God is not bound by time and space. He's outside of time and space. So he's not only is he immanent, he's also transcendent. And not only is he transcendent in his essence, he's also immanent in his personal energies. And theophanies are special manifestations, right? I mean, God is present everywhere in terms of being omnipresent, obviously. But theophanies are special manifestations of God himself within time and space in a unique way. These theophanies come and go. And this is why St. Gregory Palamas can say that there are different types of energetic manifestations and actions of God. Some of them are eternal, and some of them are temporal. Some of them come and go within time and space, but they're still God himself. And so in that sense, we don't set up a dialectic between how, well, God can't do this because it would mean that he is changeable. Well, we don't have a dialectic between stasis and change in terms of God himself, because God transcends the logical categories and dialectics, as St. Gregory Palamas says, echoing all the way back to St. Maximus, echoing all the way back to the earliest writings of people like St. Dionysius in the Divine Names. After these days, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. This is the word of John 1, and that is, of course, Jesus, right? The Logos, Jesus, came to Abraham in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid, I am your shield and your great reward." So Abraham knows that his reward is in heaven. It's Christ. It's not ultimately an earthly kingdom. It's God himself that is the reward of the righteous and of all those who have the faith of Abraham, us. Abram said, "Lord, well, what will you give me, seeing that as I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, the son of Masech, my domestic maidservant?" Abram said, "Look, you've given me no offspring. Indeed, my household servant is the heir." And the voice of the Lord came to him and said, this is the Logos again, "He will not be your heir, but one who will come from you shall be your heir." Now, the one that comes from him, of course, is Isaac in terms of the immediate fulfillment. But the one here is capitalized in your Orthodox study Bible, or in the Septuagint, presumably, because it's a prediction of Christ. Christ is the one who will ultimately be the heir of Abraham. And God brought Abraham out and said, "Look towards the stars of heaven and see if you're able to count them." And he says, "So shall your seed be." So the seed of Abraham is not just physical or biological. For a time period, it's strictly physical and biological, but ultimately it's a promise of those who are baptized into Christ. That's the real seed, according to Galatians 3 and Romans 4 and Romans 5. And then Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. This is Paul's proof text that we are saved by not keeping the Mosaic laws, but by faith in God's own promise. And that faith is not just a mental notional work, a noetic work. That's part of it. It's also a living active faith. It's a faith that's demonstrated by works. The works don't merit or earn us the status with God, but they give evidence to the fact that our faith is real and living and not just mental or rational or notional. And so good works are always present in those who have true faith. Then he said to him, I am the God who brought you out of Ur of Chaldees, and I will give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Master, Lord, how will I know that I'll inherit it? And then God says, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a pigeon. So notice how 3 keeps coming up. 3, 3, 3. Again, probably some emblematic of the Trinity here. And we saw that if you saw my talk on Elijah, we saw the triad and the 3 symbolism coming up there in his confrontation with the prophets of Baal. If you haven't watched that video, go watch that video or read the essay that I wrote on the typology of Elijah. So Abraham brought these to him, to God, to Christ, and he cut them in half down the middle and placed each part opposite of the other. And he did not cut the birds in two. And the vultures came down to the carcasses. Abraham drove the vultures away. Now remember, vultures are unclean birds. And now around sunset, a trance fell on Abraham. And behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in the land of Egypt. So here we have another prediction of the going down to Egypt. Here Abraham is a prophet, not just a priest and king to God, but a kind of prophet as well, because he's going to know the future of the Jews going into bondage in Egypt. He says, a nation that they will serve, I will judge, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. So he's telling them about in the future, your descendants are going to be slaves in Egypt, and then I'm going to set them free. And he says, but as for you, you will go to your fathers in peace, which means that he'll go and die in peace, and he will be buried at a good old age. And then in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet filled up. So God actually knows in his providence the measure of the sins of the Amorites, which reaches a certain pinnacle or plateau, and then the Amorites are done with. And so even sin is known in terms of God's omniscience here to have a certain limit or measure until God chastises and puts an end to it. And it came to pass when the sun went down that there was a flame. Here's another theophany, another manifestation. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven and lamps of fire that passed between. And so this is a liturgy. There's a kind of evening liturgy that goes on here in this theophany, and the lamps of fire that pass between the divided animal carcasses that are sacrificed. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, I will give this land that you see here to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, to the river Euphrates, to the Kenites, to the Kenizzites, to the Cabanites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Uaites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So here we have the promise of the land, the promise of the nation, that he will make his name into a great dynasty, right? The dynastic covenant. And then kings will come from him even, as we'll see. And that will be fulfilled in David. Now, the promise of the nation, the promise of the king and the dynasty and the whole world is ultimately in Jesus, you see. So we keep seeing recurring patterns, recurring cycles, even to the point where we're being told again. Remember earlier that Abraham went down to Egypt. Remember that? And when Abraham went to Egypt, he had some problems with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh wanted to get, and this was in Genesis 12, verse 10. Pharaoh wanted his wife. He wanted Sarah. And that ended up not going that well. And so God cursed Egypt because Pharaoh was trying to mess with God's covenant people, Abraham. And so the blessing and the cursing was exemplified there. And that's emblematic. Remember, God's cursing Egypt. What's that predicting? Everything that you read in Exodus when the Jews go to Egypt and God curses the Egyptians. In chapter 15, that's being restated. Your descendants, you're going to die, Abraham, but your descendants will be slaves in Egypt. And everything that you read in Genesis 12 is repeated in the descendants of Abraham in their experience in Egypt, that Abraham himself experienced in his own life in Genesis 12 in Egypt. St. Hilary, the early Latin church father, says the father here in chapter 16, we'll see with Hagar and Ishmael, but the principle is the same for chapter 15 too, is the father is the Lord, and the angel of the Lord is the Logos, Christ. The prophet Isaiah calls him the angel of great counsel in Isaiah 9:5. The Son is called an angel because he alone reveals the Father and is the messenger of the covenant. So the word angel just means messenger, right? So it doesn't mean every time a created angelic being. The word just means messenger, right? So sometimes it means the angel Gabriel, Michael. Sometimes it means Jesus, who's not a created being. So some people make mistakes because they think that, oh, well, if an angel is created, then this is Jesus, then Jesus is created. Well, no, that's just the word means messenger. And Jesus is the uncreated messenger of the covenant. So we will notice that the household of Abraham is the church at this time. Remember that, right? They're continuing the worship of God. They are the true church. The liturgy that we see there in 15 is this covenant being established again. So it's Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 22 that you have these major restatements of the covenant between God and Abraham. And they're all, you could say, the Abrahamic covenant is all those, right? Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore no children, but he had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, now see, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Notice, miraculous birth. She's barren. The barren miraculously gives birth to Isaac, right? Hagar, who is going to be the replacement maidservant, who's going to have the surrogate that Abraham initially says, well, I'll just have a kid with you and you can be the heir. And God says, no, I'm going to do a miracle with Sarah, who's barren, and she's going to have a miracle child. These are all types of the virgin birth, the miracle birth of Jesus. And we'll see this recurring theme, too, by the way, of the barren woman miraculously giving birth, right? John the Baptist is one of these. Hannah and Samuel in Books of Kings, that's another one. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to Abraham and said, be the wife. And Abraham dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and Hagar conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress Sarai became despised. She became despised in the eyes of Sarah. Sarah said, my wrong be upon you. I gave your maid to embrace, and when she conceived, I became despised. May God judge between you and me. So Abram said to Sarah, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do with her as you please. So Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar, and she fled from her. So she banishes Hagar. Now the angel of the Lord, Jesus, Logos, found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness on the way to Shur. And he said to her, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hand. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your seed exceedingly, that you may not be counted because of its multitude. And again, the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son. You will call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has taken notice of your humiliation. He will be a rustic man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he will dwell in the presence of his brethren. Then Hagar cried out the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees. For she said, I have seen the one who appeared to me face to face. So here, again, we see a theophany. Even Hagar is treated as a true believer because she sees Christ. She sees him face to face. Therefore, the well will be known as the well of him I saw before me. It is the well between Kadesh Bered. Since he is God, the angel commanded Hagar. She obeyed. This angel was Jesus, the Logos, the note says correctly. The angel then spoke to Hagar concerning the father and said, the Lord has taken notice of your humiliation. Hagar called the angel who appeared to her, both Lord and God. The church knows him as the only begotten Son of the Father, John 1. And as the Father is only begotten, he is the true God of true God, as the Creed says. The meaning of the name God here is, you are the God who sees me, the only begotten who sees everything, and who is therefore omniscient. Therefore, this is a statement of Jesus possessing the same omniscience as the Father. So, really important text about the deity of Christ. But if you don't know that the angel of the Lord is Jesus, you wouldn't know that. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. Now we come to another key chapter, an important section, which is the institution of circumcision. Circumcision is a type, it's a symbol, it has a lot of foreshadowing and significance that the book of Colossians and the book of Romans will be very clear about for signifying baptism. Now, circumcision was obviously a limited ritual because it was only for males, right? Women couldn't be circumcised. So circumcision had a temporal time frame up until the coming of the Messiah and baptism. And then it has passed away and it's no longer needed. So after the coming of Christ, circumcision doesn't matter, right? This is what Paul says many times over in the New Testament. And of course, the church has many times over in the canons, the ancient canons of the church, affirmed that there's no need for circumcision anymore. This is another reason why some of the Oriental churches are guilty of falling into the practice of Judaizing, because I think some of the Coptics still practice circumcision, and that is Judaizing. We don't do circumcision anymore. And so circumcision was a symbol of the casting away of the male foreskin, the male member, which signified the removal of the hard heart, the removal of sin, the removal of the corruption of the transgression through natural progeny, natural procreation. Now, natural procreation is not in itself evil, but it's just a symbol. It's a type. It's a ritual that signified what was to come in baptism. And so baptism completes circumcision. And because we see in the New Testament whole households baptized, whole households are accepted, and then God always operated this way. Whole households were accepted into the covenant on the basis of the head of the household's faith. All the way back to Genesis 17, we thus have always practiced infant baptism. Jesus says, "Do not forbid not the children to come unto me." Right? Let them come unto me, and that's why in the Orthodox Church we alone have preserved the tradition of infants also partaking of communion. Right? If they're members of the body of Christ, they're also members of his flesh and blood. When Abraham was 99, the Lord appeared again to him. "I'm the Lord your God. Be pleasing before me and blameless." So here is a covenant stipulation. So notice the covenant is not without stipulations. And sometimes, again, some of the Protestant sects and some of the Calvinist sects will try to say that, the Abrahamic covenant never had stipulations. It was a covenant of grace. And the other covenants are covenants of works. But actually, we see here in 17, be blameless. "And I will establish my covenant between you, and I will multiply you exceedingly." Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be a father of many nations. No longer shall you be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham." So here we have the tradition of renaming, giving a name of significance. Hence, in the Orthodox Church, when you become Orthodox, you take on a namesake. Right? I'm Daniel, I'm Prophet Daniel. And that goes back to when Abraham is renamed. Right? And he says, "For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you. Kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you." And again, remember that ultimately the seed is not just Moses and David, but Jesus. "And I will give your seed the land that you are occupying as a sojourner, and the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." Now, after the Jews possessed the land of Canaan, right, when we read the book of Joshua, they get exiled. So everlasting here doesn't mean literally everlasting, right? And after the coming of Christ, the Jews were not in Canaan's land for 2,000 years, right? Because you'll get people who say, oh, this is not talking about the New Testament and the church. It's talking literally only about the Israelites. And they'll say, see, it says everlasting, so you can't say this is about the church. It's only about the Jews. Well, if it's everlasting, then how come the Jews were banished from the promised land multiple times for thousands of years? So everlasting here is not ultimately talking about a patch of land in Palestine. It's talking about the whole world. And the whole world in the sense of the new heavens and the new earth. This is talking about the eschaton. And that's how Hebrews 11 interprets it. The city of God, whose builder and foundation is God, not man. Right? The city that we're talking about, the Jerusalem that we're talking about, is the Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem, Paul says, not a place over in Palestine. Our citizenship is in heaven, Paul says. And here's a key note on circumcision too that shows the promises are not just to the Jews, which is that the rite of circumcision was not the covenant itself. It was a sign of this covenant, verse 11. It was a temporary sign because it only applied to Abraham's genealogy and to males, that is to Abraham's physical lineage, and also to those that were born in his house or bought with his money. Thus, the rite did not apply to the many nations or the Gentiles. How could all the nations be blessed in Abraham when the covenant of Abraham is limited to, according to some people's argument, circumcision and Judaism? The world can't become Judaized in the sense of accepting the religion of Judaism. Oh, but they can become Judaized in the sense of accepting the religion of Christianity, which is the fulfillment of these covenants. So the rite of circumcision actually did not apply to many nations and many Gentiles, although the covenant includes the promise to many nations and Gentiles, and that they would be made righteous by faith in the gospel of the Messiah, Romans 4, 9 through 17. So Christ himself fulfilled this ritual and this rite, and he brought it to an end in Luke 2:21. So what you see in Genesis 17 is fulfilled in Luke 2:21, and that's why for us the circumcision of Christ is so important. Just a few nights ago, right before Christmas, I was listening to Luke over and over and over in terms of the birth of Christ, and it finally hit me how important and why the circumcision of Christ is mentioned. And the circumcision of Christ is mentioned in Luke because it's trying to show that Genesis 17 is fulfilled here. So the dumb evangelicals and the premillennials, they put all this stuff in the future, which is a Judaizing error. And it's not all in the future. It's all fulfilled in the coming of Christ. The Gospels explain and state that these promises and predictions in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22 are fulfilled when Jesus comes the first time. Right? And if you read Luke 2:21, and then 22, 23, 24, when Jesus is dedicated, those the offering of the pigeons and the turtle doves, Leviticus 12:8, according to the law of Moses, that's fulfilling those things. All of those things in the law of Moses in Leviticus 12, the sacrifices of Abraham with the pigeons and the turtle doves, that's fulfilled right here. It's looking ahead to when Jesus comes and he's presented in the temple. So Genesis 17, the sign of the covenant, is pointing to this: when Christ is circumcised, that's the fulfillment of Genesis 17. Now, by extension, obviously, when we're baptized, that's how we're brought into this covenant, because it's one covenant. This is key to understand. From Adam to Noah, to Abraham, to Moses, to David, it's one covenant successively being fulfilled in these phases and stages that sometimes theologians call it redemptive history. And redemptive history has these phases and stages, and then it comes to fruition and fulfillment when the Messiah comes. And that's why St. Jerome can say in his commentary, we are living in the last times now. We are in the end times. When Jesus came the first time, that inaugurated the end times. So the whole church period since Christ came, the last 2,000 years, is the, quote, end times. And yes, there's the end times at the end of time. Right? So, ultimately, as we said, the covenant is brought to fulfillment when Jesus comes. And then ultimately, he inaugurates that last stage of human history, which is the church era in which we live. We live in that age of the church. The fulfillment of all of God's plans for history is the church, Paul says in Ephesians. And circumcision is fulfilled in Luke 2. These passages, by the way, in Genesis 17 of this section of the covenant, they are read during Lent, in the fifth week of Great Lent. And that's because Lent is, reminding us of these redemptive historical mysteries. The ones that we just read, this is read on the feast of the circumcision of Christ. That's why the Orthodox Church has a feast for circumcision, because the feast of circumcision signifies and shows that the rite of circumcision is fulfilled. And hence Paul's many letters and disputes and arguments making this very point, and why we don't go back to Judaism and Judaizing. The whole book of Hebrews is making this point clearly. So we go on to read, God said to Abraham, as for you, you will keep my covenant and your seed throughout their generations. This is the covenant that you will keep between me and you and your seed, everyone after you through your generations. Every male will be circumcised. You'll be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. It will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. A child of 8 days old, and that's again, remember, this is predicting the events that will happen to Jesus in Luke 2. Every male child through your genealogy, he was to be born in your house, bought with money from a foreigner, not of your seed, or a foreigner, not of your seed. He is brought into the house who is bought with money. My covenant will be with you in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And every uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, on the eighth day, the soul will be cut off from his people, for he has broken the covenant. So you have to do this, right? You can't say, oh, well, I'm going to keep the covenant, but I'm not going to be initiated into the covenant. No, you have to do it. It's not optional. And then God renames Sarai, and he says, her name will not be called Sarai, but Sarah. And I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her, and I will bless him, and he shall become nations, kings, and people shall come from him. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and God said in his mind, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said, oh, that Ishmael might be the one. And God said, it will not be Ishmael, but I will establish an everlasting covenant through Isaac. And because Sarah laughs, his name is Isaac. But even still, with Ishmael, there is still a blessing for Ishmael. So Abraham took Ishmael his son and all who were in his house, and he circumcised them in the foreskins. And Abraham was 99 when he was circumcised in his flesh, and Ishmael his son was 30. And that very day that Abraham was circumcised, so was his son Ishmael. And all the men of his house who were born in that house were circumcised. So here we have the institution of what will mark the national covenant and being a part of this national tribe and covenant, which is circumcision. As we said, a type of ancestral sin, because it shows that through the male seed, there is a passing on of Adam's corruption, that you can't be saved through physical descent, right? So circumcision is also signifying the inability of the flesh to save itself, because it perpetuates death and corruption. It's not evil in itself. Sexual relations are not evil. That's how humans come to be. Jesus will come to be through human lineage. He's not a product, obviously, of Adam's seminal seed, but he is a miraculous birth in human nature. And of course, in the church, marriage and married life is a sacrament, so obviously it's not evil in itself. And so we read in Act 18, there's one Lord here. God appeared to Abraham at the oak of Mamre. As he was sitting in his tent door in the noon hour, he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men stood before him. Now, in the history of the Orthodox Church, there's a little bit of confusion of this because you see the icon of the Trinity, and you see 3 angels, and sometimes, oh, that's the Trinity that appeared to Abraham. Now, the solution to this is that, strictly speaking, the Trinity is not appearing, but it's a symbol of the Trinity because there are 3 angels here. But we have to be careful because in 19, it's these same 3. Only one of them is the Lord. So 19:1 makes it very clear that the 2 angels, right? It's the 2 that are here, and one of them is the Lord. So it's symbolic of the Trinity, but it's not actually each person of the Trinity manifesting here. Now, there is, in a sense, a triadic mode to any theophany, right? But we believe that each person in the triad can enter into a unique mode of being, a unique tropos that the other 2 do not. So, for example, the Trinity didn't die on the cross, right? The second person of the Godhead died on the cross. So there's the ability, we believe in our theology, for one hypostasis to enter into a mode of being and enact actions in a certain way that are unique to that person that are still common actions of the Godhead. In the same way, God can be present in a theophany. In a sense, the Trinity is present, but also in another sense, it's the Logos that's specifically the focus of the theophanies. Some theophanies are like the baptism of the Lord. We see the voice, we hear the voice of the Father, we see the Son, and then the Spirit as a dove. So that's symbolic, all right, of the triad. The Trinity is being shown there, but we're not literally seeing the Father. And that's why we hear a voice and know, because no man has at any time seen the Father. This is an important point. The only way to see the Father is to see the Son. The only perfect icon of the hypostasis of the Father is the hypostasis of the Son. And that's the traditional Orthodox view. That's why, strictly speaking, you're not supposed to make iconic liturgical representations of God the Father. The only liturgical iconic representation that's allowed of the Father is the Son. Now, sometimes in artworks and so forth, people picture the Father. It's not technically supposed to be done, but people do it. But what we could say then about this chapter is that, in a sense, yes, the 3 here could be emblematic or symbolic of the Trinity, but it's not. The person of the Father is not an angel. So we're going to pause here because this is getting into a good section that we want to prepare for the promise of a son again to Sarah. Sarah's going to laugh again, and there will be the naming of Isaac because of Sarah laughing, because Isaac means laughter. And then we're going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and the sons of Lot, the sin of Lot, Lot's mistake, Abraham's interactions with Abimelech, and then the important chapter 22, which will kind of close out the important, 12, 15, 17, 22, the important chapters that deal with the Abrahamic covenant. And 22 will be the closure of the Abrahamic covenant. And then we'll have the death and burial of Sarah and the next generation. Right? So we'll move out of the phase of Abraham and Sarah, and we'll move into the next generation of Isaac. Abraham will still be old. He will continue into his older days. And we'll have Ishmael, Isaac, and Jacob and Esau. That's the next generation of drama and disputes and adventures in Genesis. So thank you guys for this. Hope you enjoyed the exposition here of Genesis 14, 15, 16, 17. And be sure and stay tuned to this. I think next up we'll probably do another one of the Globalism Books talks. I'm not sure which one we'll do. Or I may just buckle down and do the next section of Genesis and cover 19, 21, 22. God bless. Talk to you soon.